When the first B-29 seconds appeared over the Pacific, Japanese pilots laughed. They called it the flying apartment, too big, too slow, too obvious to survive. They said it would fall before it ever reached Japan, but they didn't understand what it really was. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress wasn't just an airplane. It was a machine built to erase distance, to turn oceans into runways and clouds into battlefields. Its wings carried more fuel than some ships. Its engines were monsters wrapped in aluminum, and its bomb bays, vast, cold, and endless, were designed not for skirmishes, but for transformation. In the summer of 1945, Japan learned what that meant. When the sirens over Tokyo wailed, people looked up and saw something impossible, hundreds of black dots, stretching from one horizon to the other. The sky wasn't blue anymore. It was silver and shadow. And as the first wave released its load, the city below vanished into flame. Wind became fire. Streets became rivers of light. And the pilots who once mocked the B-29 realized the truth too late, that the biggest target in the sky had just become the deadliest weapon on Earth. Before the fire came, there was laughter. In 1943, when Japan's fighter aces first heard of America's new super bomber, they treated it like a joke. A plane that big? 60 tons of metal? Pressurized cabins? It sounded like fantasy or desperation. The Japanese had been flying light, agile fighters aircraft that turned, danced, and struck like knives in the wind. The Americans, it seemed, were trying to build a flying warehouse. They gave it a nickname in mockery, the Flying Hotel. A machine that large, they said, couldn't fight, couldn't hide, couldn't even climb fast enough to escape. To them, size meant weakness. They believed the war belonged to speed and skill to men, not machines. But across the ocean, in Kansas, engineers at Boeing were building something that defied every rule of flight. The B-29 wasn't a bomber, it was an ecosystem. 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each with over 2,000 horsepower, powered its massive wings. A new pressurization system allowed it to fly higher than any fighter in the world, above 30,000 feet, where thin air turned propellers into whispers. Its remote-controlled gun turrets could track enemy fighters automatically, guided by gyroscopic computers. And inside its fuselage, sleek, silver, and seamless, were 2 enormous bomb bays capable of carrying nearly 20,000 pounds of explosives halfway across an ocean. It was not a plane built for one battle. It was built for every one that would come after. By 1944, the first B-29 seconds rolled out of American factories, thousands of riveters, welders, and engineers working day and night under floodlights, each one assembling the weapon that would cross the Pacific. They called it Project Silverplate. Each new B-29 was a flying fortress made of logic and ambition, the most expensive weapon America had ever built. But when the first squadrons reached the Marianas, the laughter began again. Japanese reconnaissance pilots flying over Saipan reported airfields full of silver giants. Officers in Tokyo smirked. "They'll never reach us," one said. "The winds will tear them apart." Others believed Japan's anti-aircraft defenses, the so-called flak umbrella, would shred them long before they touched the homeland. What they didn't realize was that the B-29 seconds had already conquered the winds. They flew higher than the Zero could reach. They carried radar so precise they could bomb through clouds. And when the jet stream, that invisible river of air roaring over Japan, tried to push them aside, American engineers learned to ride it, not fight it. They used nature as a weapon. Still, early missions were brutal. The first B-29 raids on Japan faced storms, malfunctions, and deadly interceptors. Crews froze in their pressurized cabins as oxygen masks iced over. Engines caught fire mid-air. Dozens of bombers vanished over the Pacific, swallowed by distance. But every time they launched, they learned. And every time they learned, they got closer. By early 1945, the laughter in Tokyo began to fade. The bombers weren't vanishing anymore. They were multiplying. Each wave came higher, heavier, faster. Then came the night of the 9th of March, 1945, when over 300 B-29 seconds lifted off from the Marianas, flying low, silent, and unstoppable. Their orders were simple: erase Tokyo. The night of the 9th of March, 1945, began like any other in Tokyo. Children were sleeping in wooden houses. Air raid wardens patrolled quiet streets, and the hum of distant engines so faint it blended with the wind passed almost unnoticed. For weeks, American bombers had flown high over the city, their silver bodies glinting in daylight, their bombs missing by miles. Tokyo had learned to ignore them. Too high, too slow, one Japanese pilot had said. They cannot hit what they cannot see. But this night would be different. This night, the bombers were coming lower. At bases on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian and Guam, hundreds of B-29 Superfortresses stood in rows under floodlights. Crews moved like shadows across the tarmac, checking fuel, loading bombs, and strapping themselves into cold metal seats. Inside each aircraft, the same order was printed in black ink: primary target, Tokyo. Objective, incendiary saturation. The bombs they carried were not high explosives. They were clusters of M69 incendiaries, small cylinders filled with napalm gel and magnesium. When dropped, they wouldn't just explode. They would burn. They would crawl. They would consume oxygen and turn streets into rivers of fire. Brigadier General Curtis LeMay had made the decision. High-altitude bombing hadn't worked. From now on, the B-29 seconds would fly low 5,000 to 8,000 feet below radar, under the winds, fast and heavy. They would come not as precision bombers, but as an avalanche of flame. At 5:35 p.m., the first engines roared to life. The sound rolled across the island chain like thunder rising from the ocean. Mechanics covered their ears as propellers blurred to invisible circles. One by one, the silver giants took off 334 of them, climbing into the dark. From the cockpits, the world looked peaceful at first, a sheet of stars above, endless black water below. Then, slowly, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. Japan. The crews switched to oxygen masks. Cabin lights dimmed. Radios whispered in code. They were ghosts now, invisible until it was too late. At 11:30 p.m., Tokyo's air raid sirens began to howl. The first wave had reached the city. Japanese lookouts on the coast shouted warnings. Enemy aircraft approaching from the south. But by then, the sky was already full. The bombers came in waves, engines droning in perfect unison, an airborne armada spread across 50 miles. They flew so low that people on rooftops could see the silver undersides of their wings glinting in the moonlight. Then, the bomb bays opened. At first, it sounded like rain. Then came the roar. Thousands of M69 firebombs cascaded down, bursting open on impact, each one spraying burning napalm across entire blocks. The gel clung to everything: wood, paper, skin. The city, built of bamboo and cedar, ignited like tinder. The wind that night, steady from the north, turned the fires into a storm. Flames met flames, merging, growing, feeding. The first neighborhoods to vanish were working-class districts, miles of tightly packed homes. In minutes, streets disappeared under moving sheets of fire. The air turned red. Those who tried to run found the heat unbearable. Shoes melted on cobblestones, and the smoke rolled low, choking everything alive. Inside his cockpit, a B-29 gunner watched the glow spread across the map grid below. "It's like looking into a furnace," he whispered. Another crewman replied, "That's not a furnace, that's a city." The wind picked up. Temperatures on the ground soared past 1,000 degrees Celsius. The oxygen inside entire districts was consumed in seconds, creating firestorms that sucked people, cars, and even small buildings into the blaze. In some places, the asphalt boiled. One Japanese officer, watching from an air defense post, tried to call for reinforcements. There were none. Fighters couldn't take off. The heat warped the airfields themselves. He dropped his phone and whispered, "It's like the sky has fallen." The B-29 seconds flew through the turbulence, their wings buffeted by rising columns of hot air. The crews could feel the heat through the metal skin of their aircraft, smell the burning city even at 7,000 feet. One pilot wrote later, "It was as if we were flying over hell, and the gates were open." Below, Tokyo burned without sound. There was no time to scream. The roar of the flames drowned everything. The second wave came an hour later, more B-29 seconds, more fire, more light. The target zones overlapped, turning Tokyo into a single living blaze. From the air, it looked like molten glass spreading outward from the city center. From the ground, it looked like the end of the world. By midnight, Tokyo was no longer a city, it was a single, breathing flame. The B-29 seconds circled in long, sweeping arcs, their bombs falling in rhythm like drumbeats. The wind turned into a weapon, whipping the fire through alleyways and canals, carrying sparks for miles. Every time the crews thought the glow couldn't grow brighter, the horizon proved them wrong. Inside the burning districts, the world had no direction anymore. Streets, rooftops, and rivers had merged into one landscape of orange light. Families ran toward the Sumida River, believing water would save them. When they reached it, they found the river boiling. The reflection of the flames made it look like liquid fire. A Japanese fire warden named Kiyoshi wrote later in his diary, "The air burned first, then the people." He stopped writing when his pencil melted in his hand. Anti-aircraft batteries still tried to fire, but the smoke blinded them. The guns overheated, then stopped one by one. Pilots scrambled to intercept the bombers, but the heat rising from the city threw their engines into chaos. Propellers stalled mid-climb. Some planes caught the updraft and flipped, others simply vanished into the inferno below. From the ground, witnesses said the sky looked alive, a sea of silver fish swimming in waves of light. The roar of the engines mixed with the crackle of burning wood until it became one sound, endless, merciless. At 12:30 a.m., the second phase began. The remaining B-29 seconds dropped magnesium flares to mark new targets, as if the entire city needed direction to burn more. The flares drifted slowly, ghostly white, then burst into cascades of sparks. Beneath them, the wind carried flames into fresh districts that had survived the first wave. In one of those neighborhoods, a Japanese pilot named Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi ran toward his airfield. He had once called the B-29 a lumbering whale. Now, as he looked up through the smoke, he realized the whales were endless. He saw them gliding through the night silhouettes of metal, indifferent and cold. "They do not fight," he whispered. "They only deliver." He never reached his plane. A gust of fire rolled across the field, lifting debris like shrapnel. His squadron disappeared in a single breath. In the air above, B-29 crews watched the firestorm twist itself into pillars, tornadoes of flame spinning up from the city, reaching thousands of feet high. The turbulence was so violent that bombers hundreds of miles apart felt their wings shake. Some were thrown upward, others downward. One aircraft flipped upside down, lost 3,000 feet, and somehow righted itself again. "Down below," one navigator said later, "it was like watching a world drown in light." The fire spread faster than people could run. The oxygen vanished. Those who tried to hide in basements suffocated as the flames above consumed every breath. Others jumped into canals, only to be boiled alive when the water flashed into steam. From miles away, fishermen at sea saw the glow rising over the horizon, a dome of light so huge that it illuminated the ocean around them. One captain thought it was sunrise, until he realized the direction was wrong. Inside his cockpit, Major Robert Morgan, pilot of a B-29 named Dauntless Dottie, looked down at the inferno and felt the heat reach even through the floor. His co-pilot turned away from the window and whispered, "God forgive us." Morgan didn't answer. He was too busy watching the storm. It wasn't destruction anymore. It was movement, the fire breathing, spreading, feeding itself. The updrafts reached speeds of 200 miles an hour, sucking debris thousands of feet into the air. Entire burning roofs and timbers whirled upward and collided with the bombers. One plane lost a propeller to a flaming beam. Another had its paint scorched off mid-flight. Still, the formation held. They flew their routes, dropped their payloads, turned, and climbed through the heat. In the gunners' domes, the city looked like a living map of veins, every street glowing, every river a molten line. By 2 a.m., the fire had devoured 16 square miles of Tokyo. 1 million people were homeless. Tens of thousands were gone. The smoke reached 25,000 feet into the stratosphere. It bent the moonlight, turned the stars crimson, and carried the smell of ash all the way to the ships patrolling off the coast. A radio operator aboard the USS Curtis logged the sight in his journal. "The city is gone. The horizon burns like a sunrise that never ends." Above it all, the B-29 seconds turned for home. The crews were silent. No victory cheers, no words, just the sound of engines droning through the dark. Behind them, Tokyo burned on its own, a machine set in motion, a storm that didn't need pilots anymore. By 3 a.m., the fire had swallowed Tokyo whole. The map no longer existed. The landmarks were gone, temples, schools, parks, bridges, all reduced to an ocean of light and shadow. The heart of the empire was a furnace now, its arteries glowing red. From the air, it looked like the planet itself had cracked open. The heat was beyond comprehension. Thermometers later estimated 1,600 degrees Celsius in the center districts, hot enough to melt aluminum, to fuse glass into stone. The fire didn't move across the city moved inside the fire. In the distance, the imperial palace stood like an island of darkness, surrounded by flame. Even its moat steamed. Guards threw water from buckets that evaporated before it hit the ground. In the shelters, civilians huddled in silence, praying as the air thinned. The flames made no distinction, soldier or child, steel or silk. Everything was equal under the weight of heat. Outside, the firestorm created its own weather. Winds reached hurricane force, pulling oxygen from miles away. Smoke clouds climbed so high they formed their own lightning flashes of blue and white, tearing through the black. It was not a city anymore. It was a storm made of fire. At sea, sailors aboard the destroyer Reno watched the glow climb into the heavens. The radar screens were useless, filled with static from the flames. "It looks like Japan is burning from the inside," one officer whispered. "Like the Earth's core has reached the surface." Back in the bombers, the crews were already hours into their return flights. The cabin lights were dim, the air inside heavy with fuel and silence. Some gunners stared out their plexiglass domes, watching the reflection of the inferno fade into the clouds below. Others just sat in the dark, their eyes hollow. Nobody spoke about victory. They had seen too much light to feel triumphant. The B-29 seconds landed one by one on the Marianas, their tires black with soot from their own shadows. Ground crews ran to meet them, shouting, checking fuel, counting the planes that had made it back. Out of 334, only 14 were lost. It was a success by every military definition. And yet, not a single crewman cheered. General Curtis LeMay lit a cigarette and stared at the incoming aircraft. "They'll hate me for it," he said quietly. "But we're here to end a war, not win a debate." In Tokyo, the survivors crawled from cellars into a dawn that wasn't blue, it was grey and red. The air shimmered with heat even after the flames had died. Everything smelled of iron and smoke. The streets were gone. The rivers were clogged with debris and bodies. The silence was absolute, too complete to be real. A Japanese doctor who wandered through the ruins at sunrise wrote later, "I saw no people, only shapes. They were lying where the streets used to be. I thought I was walking on another planet." The numbers would take months to confirm. 16 square miles destroyed, over 100,000 dead, 1 million homeless. The single deadliest air raid in human history, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki. And it had all been carried out by machines once mocked for being too big to matter. From that night forward, Japan stopped laughing at the B-29. Every air raid siren, every radar echo, every distant rumble in the clouds brought panic. The flying apartment had become a god of fire. The B-29 wasn't just a bomber anymore. It was a symbol of an era the moment humanity learned it could burn a city faster than it could comprehend it. One pilot wrote home weeks later, "We used to think size was weakness, but up there, in the glow, I realized size is power, size is reach, size is forever." In the months that followed, the Superfortress would keep coming. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, city after city, each one erased in the same storm of fire. The Japanese Air Force tried to intercept, but the B-29 seconds flew higher, faster, smarter. The skies belonged to them. And when the final mission came, when the B-29 named Enola Gay lifted off with a single bomb destined for Hiroshima, even the pilots who once mocked the aircraft didn't laugh anymore. They looked up and remembered the night Tokyo disappeared beneath it, because that night, the B-29 didn't just destroy a city, it destroyed the illusion that man still controlled the sky. By the summer of 1945, the B-29 ruled the sky. Japan had stopped mocking it. The pilots who once called it a lumbering target now stared upward whenever they heard the distant hum of its engines, a sound that meant the end of another city. There was no defense left. no altitude safe enough, no night dark enough, no prayer loud enough. Every dawn began the same way, distant thunder rolling from the Pacific, then sirens, then fire. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, each one vanished beneath the same silver wings. The bombers came in formations that filled the horizon, their shadows crossing the sea like clouds that refused to move. The Japanese fighter corps was dying faster than it could be replaced. The few pilots who made it into the air found themselves climbing toward ghosts. The B-29 flew higher than any Zero could reach, their vapor trails drawing white scars across the blue. The machine gun fire that once protected Japan's skies now vanished into empty air. "We couldn't touch them," one surviving pilot said. "They were gods made of metal." The Americans called the campaign Operation Meeting House, but the Japanese had another name for it, the Rain of Fire. Every time a new target city was chosen, the civilians didn't ask where the bombers were coming from, they asked how long they had left. In Tokyo's ruins, survivors scavenged melted pots and burned bricks. The emperor's voice still promised victory on the radio, but everyone knew the truth. The war had become a storm, and the storm had an address, the B-29. Even the men who flew it began to change. They were no longer just airmen. They were operators of something larger than war itself. Inside the pressurized cabin, the world below looked unreal patches of light and smoke that shifted like clouds. The pilots read maps, the bombardiers calibrated angles, the gunners stared into glass domes, and together they performed a ritual that no one would ever forget. "Ready, open bomb doors." The click of the switches echoed like a heartbeat, then the sudden silence before release, the endless seconds where gravity waited and history held its breath. And then, the roar. On the 26th of July 1945, hundreds of B-29 returned to Tokyo one last time. The city had already burned, yet command wanted to prove a point, that there was no sanctuary, not even in ashes. They dropped no leaflets, no warnings, no mercy, just more fire. From the air, the ruins still glowed faintly in the dark, as if the ground remembered. From the ground, the bombers looked like ghosts, returning to finish what they'd begun. That night, Emperor Hirohito stood at the window of his palace and watched the horizon turn red again. He said nothing. No one spoke. The light said everything. For the Americans, it was victory by arithmetic. For the Japanese, it was the end of faith. But even as the bombers returned home, engineers were already preparing something greater, something smaller, quieter, deadlier. In New Mexico, under blinding light, they tested a device that would make every previous firestorm look primitive, and they chose the only machine in the world capable of carrying it, the B-29. When Enola Gay took off from Tinian on the 6th of August 1945, it looked no different from the hundreds of others that had flown before it, silver, flawless, indifferent. The crew joked nervously, unaware that their mission would split history in two. The Japanese radar stations saw it coming and ignored it. "Just another reconnaissance bomber," they reported. For years, that size had been mocked. That morning, it was their blind spot. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened over Hiroshima. A single weapon dropped silently through the air, spinning toward the city below. Then the world changed. The explosion lit the sky brighter than the sun. The shockwave leveled everything within 2 miles. The heat melted shadows into walls. The city simply ceased. From the cockpit, co-pilot Robert Lewis whispered, "My God, what have we done?" No one answered. The radio crackled. The engines hummed. The plane turned toward home. Below them, a mushroom cloud rose 20,000 feet high, the final echo of the machine that Japan had once laughed at. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Then, silence. When Japan surrendered, it wasn't to an army or a navy, it was to a sound. The low, distant thunder of the B-29. To the world, it became the symbol of total war, the machine that ended one age and began another. Its size, once a joke, had become a silhouette burned into the memory of every survivor. Its name became a sentence. And when the smoke cleared and the cities cooled, the pilots of the Superfortress looked at the sky and realized that they had been the last generation to see war from above and to bring it down to earth. Because the B-29 didn't just change the course of a war, it changed the definition of humanity. When the engines finally went silent, the sound didn't disappear. It lingered in memory, in nightmares, in the hum of the Pacific wind. For Japan, the B-29 would never just be an airplane again. It was a shadow that had crossed the sun. In the years after the war, survivors in Tokyo and Hiroshima described the same thing, the sound of distant engines that made their hearts stop. Some called it trauma, others called it memory, but to them, that sound wasn't metal or machinery, it was judgment. Japan rebuilt, streets rose again from ashes, factories reopened, schools filled with children. Yet beneath the concrete, the soil still carried traces of the past: melted glass, fused stone, and fragments of bomb casings stamped Boeing. Every spring, when the cherry blossoms bloomed, the petals drifted over ground that had once glowed red. In America, the B-29 became a legend. It stood in museums with polished metal and proud plaques. It was photographed, celebrated, studied. Engineers called it the forerunner of the jet age, the bridge between propeller and atomic power. But among the men who flew it, pride mixed with silence. They never forgot what they saw through the glass. Some couldn't sleep without hearing the echo of the bomb bay doors opening. Others avoided air shows, unable to look at the shape of those wings against the sky. Colonel Robert Morgan, who had flown missions over Tokyo, once said, "We won with our heads, not our hearts." When asked if he would do it again, he didn't answer. He simply looked at the horizon and said, "You can't unlight the sky." The B-29 had been designed to win wars, but it had done something greater and darker. It had proven that technology could outgrow its masters. For the first time, humanity could destroy faster than it could feel. The Japanese called the bombers shinen no tori, birds from the abyss. To them, they were the face of a new world, one where distance, courage, and honor meant nothing against the cold perfection of machinery. In Hiroshima, a single preserved B-29 window panel sits in a museum display. The glass is slightly warped from heat, faintly reflecting the faces of visitors who stand before it. The caption underneath reads, "The sky fell once. We remember." Back in the United States, General Curtis LeMay defended his strategy to the end of his life. "If we'd lost," he said, "I'd have been tried as a war criminal." He wasn't wrong, but history rarely punishes the victors. The B-29 became the backbone of the early Cold War, carrying not bombs of fire, but bombs of light. Its shape evolved into the jet bombers of the next generation, the B-47, the B-52, each one echoing the same design, the same idea, that control of the sky meant control of history. And yet, as the decades passed, people began to see it differently. The gleaming metal in museum halls wasn't just a symbol of victory anymore. It was a mirror reflecting what mankind had become capable of. Pilots who once touched its controls with reverence grew old and grey. Some returned to Japan in peace, standing in silence beside men who had once tried to shoot them down. They didn't talk about blame or forgiveness. They talked about sound, about the endless hum. One Japanese survivor told an American airman, "When we heard your planes, we didn't think of death. We thought of power, power that no one should have." The B-29 had given humanity the ability to end a war, and with it, the illusion that war had limits. When the last Superfortress retired from active service in the 1,960 seconds, its engines were shut down slowly, one by one. Mechanics stood at attention as the final propeller stopped spinning. For a moment, the hangar was silent. Then someone whispered, "That sound will never die." They were right. Every modern aircraft, every jet, every missile, every spacecraft carries a piece of that legacy. The B-29 wasn't just a weapon. It was a turning point, because before it, the sky was a battlefield. After it, the sky belonged to technology. And on the night Tokyo disappeared beneath it, humanity took its first irreversible step into the atomic age. A step lit not by lightning, but by the steady hum of 4 engines cutting through the dark.